Let's talk about voting. Today I voted in a national election for the first time. And there's two parts I want to talk about. Why you should vote and sort of just political outcomes in general in the next 4 years. To kind of give the short and sweet summary, we can always expand, but the short and sweet summary is if you think in a purely consequentialist manner, you can pretty much view anything as futile. Why should I work out? Why should I try to become big and strong when, of course, we're going to get old? The body will deteriorate, eventually we'll die, and you can just imagine in your mind's eye all your flesh and your muscles deteriorating, turning into worm food, and you think, what's the point? What's the point of that? Or you can think of fame, you can think of your importance, you can think of some kind of collective life and in a Spenglerian sense, but then you can see some kind of end to that organism, some kind of end to that collective. So really we can imagine the heat death of the universe, the big crunch, the deep freeze, we can imagine the sun exploding, and we can project into the future, and no matter how we go about it, we can always reach back at a point of futility through this consequential thinking of, well, if this happens, this is going to happen anyway. And I think the only way to overcome that is to understand our actions, not in terms of their far-flung consequences, not to say that we are careless about things or we don't take that into account on some level, but that if you are encountering this demon of futility, the only way to fight it, I think, and the only way to really put a stop to it, and the most powerful refutation, is a view that our actions in themselves, regardless of whether we succeed or fail or whatever, the actions in themselves are good or bad, but that there is a innate, some people would say there's an aesthetic conception here, that there is something beautiful in the action itself, and we're not, of course it would be nice if good things came from, it's like when you plant a tree. The sentiment of planting the tree is good, and we hope that it grows into a big, beautiful tree. But in some sense, whether or not the tree comes, whether or not the tree is struck by lightning, whether or not someone cuts down the tree, the act of planting the seed itself is good. So there's a lot of different examples we can give for that. But I want people to be thinking in this way. I want people to understand this, even if on a day-to-day basis we are taking account of consequences. We are aware, hey, if I take this action, this is the outcome, this is the probability, and you're calculating that, and you're being pessimistic, or you're being realistic, or you're being cynical, or whatever we do in the day-to-day, whatever we do in the moment-to-moment, when we're hit by this kind of generalized futilism, we've got to step back. And we've got to, in some way, in some conception, come to the conclusion that actions can be good in themselves. Now, with this election, it may not be as exciting as other elections, but that's another point. I think Nietzsche said at one point that the truly hidden truths, or the truths that are the hardest to find, or the ones that are most hidden, are not the ones which are the most dangerous and edgy and crazy, but they're the truths that are the most boring, because no one wants to hear those things. And I think that's true, and I think there are a lot of boring things about this election. And at the end of the day, we have to develop a kind of discipline where even if something is boring, or we can imagine, the outcome is not going to be exciting, we have to be able to do things and be involved in things. Take physical exercise. Some days you're going to be super pumped up because you just watched a motivation compilation, euphoric hard style, dubstep remix of Dragon Ball Z, and you're all pumped up. And so in certain moments, you're going to be motivated, but most of the time, on the day-to-day, if you want consistency, which is really what builds truth and beauty and goodness, if you want consistency, you have to have the discipline to do things even when you don't want to do them, even when they're boring. That's true for building your body. That's true for building your finances. That's true for building anything. So we have to value the aesthetics of action. We have to value the beauty of doing rather than the necessarily focusing on the end object, the noun of the place we will be or the thing we will achieve, but rather focus on the doing, the verbiage, right? The action that we're taking, and understand that we aren't always going to feel compelled to take beautiful action, to take disciplined action, to take action toward health and strength and truth. But nonetheless, we have to train ourselves toward that. We have to train ourselves to have discipline. Not because there's always going to be a marshmallow at the end, or a piece of candy, or a reward, or some kind of, salvation, or there's not always going to be that thing at the end of the tunnel. And I like the idea that the kingdom of heaven is within. It's within the action. It's not somehow at the end. It's not somehow the consequence, but it's here in the now, in the present, in the action itself. So that's why I want people to vote, not because I think that one candidate or the other is going to save the country, not because we can go, and we're going to go through the examples of, I think, the different sort of scenarios that could play themselves out, but I think people should be allowed to vote cynically, in the sense of not fooling themselves, or I don't think we should rely upon lies in order to motivate ourselves to vote. And there's two different perspectives here. There's some people who their job in life is to mobilize a mass audience to vote. And in doing so, they are biased toward lies that encourage their audience to vote. I'm not that person, and so I'm not bound to those biases. Instead, I'm telling people that your actions matter on a fundamental level. All of the actions you take matter on a fundamental level. I want you to be strong, healthy. I want you to grow into the beautiful. I don't want you to allow your cynicism to stop you from acting and to grow into discipline. So as much as I promote, I think, certain forms of cynicism on this channel, I do that because I don't want people to rely upon ecstatic, euphoric lies. Because I think that is a cheap sugar. That is a cheap source of energy. It pumps you up, and then when it fails, if it's a lie, it does inevitably fail, then you become depressed. Then you become diabetic. Then you become obese. Then we have a fallout. And of course, drugs give you an even more powerful example of this. I don't want to feed people euphoric lies so that I can pump myself up and essentially use the psychic energy of those people and then have them deflate and be in a worse place than they were before. That's not what I want to do. So I want to give people the ability to handle the truth and to still nonetheless continue on, which I think is a more powerful building of character. And with respect to this election, I think there are probably three. I mean, there's infinite possibilities, I suppose, but I think there are three main visions of the future. One is in which Trump wins, and we likely get a Democratic Senate and a Democratic Congress. And there's really not much Trump can do in that scenario. And it's likely that when you look at the funding of the government, that Trump will not continue with his old strategy of prolonging government shutdowns. There's only so far he can get with that. He can attempt it as much as he wants, but he's never going to follow through ultimately where, the TSA shuts down, the airports shut down, the country grinds to a halt, you're driving on the highway and the toll station is unmanned. Those sorts of things that would happen, theoretically. The military would not shut down. The police would not shut down. But there would be certain elements of the government that would be highly visible to people. I don't think he's willing to go there. I can't imagine that. And I don't think it would ultimately accomplish anything. All that it would say is, I'm willing to, make everybody hate me in order to, slow down progress for 4 years. So I don't think he's ultimately going to be able to stop Democrats from passing new legislation. They're probably going to, in that way, through that strategy, they're probably going to pass legislation related to critical theory. They're probably going to, in some way or another, subvert the building of a fence, which I don't care about. I've never cared about. As I've explained before, the first thing you would do if you wanted to change immigration is you would eliminate birthright citizenship. He hasn't attempted to do that. And so, the more transformative immigration is the H-1B, the chain migration. It's not people sneaking in. People sneaking in don't control the media. People sneaking in don't become vice president. It's the people who are coming in legally that are changing the country fundamentally, not, some person cutting the lawn or working as a dishwasher somewhere, picking tomatoes. Those people are really fine. I mean, if that was the biggest problem you have, fine, we could talk about that. But that's really way down on the list of priorities. But they'll still probably do that as a symbolic thing. So they're going to undo certain Trump, certain aspects of Trump. And they're probably going to pass some of their own legislation, and we're probably going to see some more UBI, and we're probably going to see some more, enlargement of billionaire business and destruction of small business, and we're probably going to see some certain expansion of these health regulations. That's pretty much how the next 4 years would go if Trump won. If Biden wins, there's, I suppose, two scenarios. One in which he is totally handicapped, or Harris, either one. The Democrats are completely handicapped by the division within their own party. That is, they've created too wide of a coalition, and it's going to fall apart when Donald Trump ceases to be there. That they have united themselves on the basis of a man. And that unity can only exist up until January 2021. And after that, it all falls apart. And you actually saw a similar thing in 2016 with the Trump coalition, where there was all this unity, and then after he got into office, things very quickly all fell apart, and all the little factions that built up the Trump coalition started attacking each other. I think you could see the same thing in a Biden-Harris administration. I think you could see they come in, yay, we beat Donald Trump, and immediately the left is going to be attacking him, and they're going to be attacking Kamala, and the donor class has completely separate interests from the ideological, what I would say are the religious Democrats, the Democratists, the Democratists. I think you could see a total falling apart of that coalition in a way that would resemble, if we had to give a Republican example, it would be something like the Tea Party, or worse, I suppose, where the Democrats would be more busy fighting each other than they would be fighting the Republicans. And in that case, a lot wouldn't get done. It would pretty much be the same thing as a Trump presidency. You would have expansion of health regulations, you would have expansion of healthcare, you would have expansion of UBI, you would see, the border wall cease to exist for the most part. It doesn't even matter, but symbolically it would be subverted. Critical theory would be brought back. So all of the same things as you'd see under a Trump administration, but it would not be any more extreme than that. The third example is where things really kick into high gear, and I think I would tie this in with the election violence that we can expect to see at least some of it, but we don't know the extent. So I'm going to kind of combine maybe 3 and 4 into one here, but there possibly are 2 separate scenarios. In the main, you could have a situation where we think about Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, and we think about how, people went in and they declared an autonomous zone and they kicked out the police and blah, blah, blah. And that went on for a while, but it didn't really result in severe casualties. We could see a scenario where in every city in the United States we start to get these autonomous zones. And you've got it in every city. When you've got it in Atlanta, Georgia, when you have it in Boston, when you have it in San Francisco, when you have it in, Boise, Idaho, when you have... And I mean, people, why would they be in Idaho? Why would they be in these kinds of red states? Houston, Dallas, Miami, I don't know. There's plenty of examples where you could start to see these established autonomous zones where they're not letting in police. Now, there are 2 choices the government can make. One choice is they can do what they did in Seattle and say, okay, have fun. We'll just let you be. And then eventually, when things have died down, the enthusiasm has died down and you forget what it was all about in the first place, we roll in, we take back over. That's one scenario. The other scenario is they challenge the autonomous zone, which results in violence. You could see, I'm not saying it should or could or would happen, but you could see, I suppose I'm saying it could happen, but you could see the deployment of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, that would prevent police from coming in to these little autonomous zones, and that would result in the death of police and fiery explosions. So, I mean, because a lot of these people, frankly, they were over fighting in Syria. The Antifa, they do have guys who are experienced with Middle Eastern warfare, and so I wouldn't be surprised if all it needs, you need one guy, you need an autonomous zone, you need one guy crazy enough to do it, and all of a sudden you've got IEDs on the road. That's a very volatile situation. You also have the possibility that if the police don't do anything, you get 10 Kyle Rittenhouses. 10 of them. You don't need that many, but if we're talking about autonomous zones in every city in the United States or many of the major cities, all you need is a couple of dumb kids who have been brainwashed by Boogaloo memes and whatnot to think that they're going to be a hero if they go in and restore order and protect the country and stand up for what's right, and all of these things they think are very noble virtues and very important, and they go in and there's a violent confrontation. You get dozens of people getting killed in these shootouts as a result. So this is a possibility. It could also just be nothing, right? I don't expect any of that to happen if Biden wins outright. If Biden just sweeps the United States and Trump concedes on November 3rd, then I don't expect any of that to really happen. If there is a contested election, I expect some of this to happen to a lesser extent or greater extent, we don't know. If Trump wins outright, I still expect it to happen. So that could be a very volatile situation, and if that does happen, the fallout of that will either be Trump is removed from office by the military or who knows what, the FBI, or they simply, recount the votes in such a way that Biden wins. And if Biden wins through that kind of mechanism, rather than an outright electoral victory, if he wins through this kind of contested mass violence, autonomous zones, riots in the streets, basically taking the riots of this year and multiplying them times 10, with all that kind of violence, he is not only going to have a mandate, but he's going to have a kind of duty and necessity to hit the gas and not allow Republicans or anything like Donald Trump to ever re-enter the American consciousness. So I've given you the two scenarios where basically a Trump presidency, nothing's going to happen. I guess there are people who are thinking that, Trump presidency, his second term is going to be the real term. This was just a fake term. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's just going to be 4 years of boringness. And then it's probably going to be the same thing if Biden-Harris gets elected. But there is a chance that if there's a lot of violence and there's a contested election and it's something that is shocking to the American consciousness, you could get a situation where, we've got tanks in the streets, we've got IEDs, we've got hundreds of people dying. You could see a scenario where there's a national emergency. I mean, we've had so many of those, but essentially, you would have some sort of martial law. You would see, maybe perhaps something like a suspension of habeas corpus, or a suspension of the Second Amendment, or a suspension of the internet. Some people have suggested they could shut down the internet for a huge number of people. Remember that when people buy a domain, they do this through a domain registrar. Often it's like GoDaddy or Google or something like that. And those domain registrars are controlled by the United States. And so if the United States government decides, hey, Google, every single website that you control, we're shutting it down because we have a national emergency and we need to restore order. And that includes getting people off the streets and getting people off the internet. Maybe they would keep up the porn websites. So while everything's on fire, people can be masturbating inside. But I can imagine that happening. I can imagine a lot of things happening. And then once they finally resume control, because I don't think you would see the outbreak of an actual civil war, I think they would resume control. And once they did, then it would be sort of a pedal to the metal. We're expanding the Supreme Court. We're adding 16 justices. We are, outline hate speech. We are confiscating guns. We are doing those sort of extreme actions. I don't think that's likely, but I think that's the only scenario in which anything interesting happens. I think every other scenario, the next 4 years, are pretty predictable. So, all of that being said, should you still vote? Yes, you should still vote, because it's not about changing the outer world. It's not about electing the candidate that's going to be the most interesting, or that's going to somehow benefit you, or you're going to make a change through voting. I'm not arguing for any of that. I'm simply arguing that you should have a mindset in life that you do things and you act when presented with the opportunity. It takes about an hour to vote. You gotta drive there, you gotta find the place, you gotta go through the process, you gotta stand in the line. If you vote on November 3rd, who knows how long these lines are going to be. But you've got to do it. You've got to vote, because the argument against voting, ultimately, I think if you take that to its logical conclusion, it's an argument against living. It's an argument against everything that we do. It's an argument for these people who are, posting about violence online. They're posting about, how we're too super hyper ideological to vote, and how what you should really do is read my constitution or become involved in my new religion, or, these weirdos online who say that you shouldn't vote. You should vote. It's not about being entrapped by democracy, by the way. It's about being entrapped by the concept of futility. It's about lack of discipline. I don't think, really, honestly, as much as democracy is a distraction to people, I don't think it's more of a distraction than this nagging, annoying feeling people have, this doubt of like, well, should I vote? Should I not vote? It's almost like there are people out there who won't vote, who have probably thought more about the political process than people who are voting. And it's like, just stop wasting your time thinking about it and just go do it. And it's not exciting. I don't think I guess there's some people who are excited about it. But for my personal opinion, I voted, and then I was walking around and I heard this guy talking about, oh, I saw these Trump supporters and they were annoying and they really think that waving the American flag is going to make me vote for Trump. And, I get all these text messages saying to vote for Trump and I'm like responding to them and I'm so smart and, I know about my civic duty and I know way more than them and they think that's actually going to convince me. And it was sad because, I kind of wanted to say something to this guy and I was like, what can I really say? He's so smug. He's so above it all. He's so arrogant that what could I say? What could I say to this guy to, let him know how much of a jerk I think he is? I thought there's really not much I can say. Ultimately, it is very sad and unfortunate that we have an election which is basically about one set of religious fundamentalists, which is the Democrats at this point, who believe in socialism to a large degree, who are willing to use power, who want to see, ultimately, who really want to see the American military spring into action and flex its muscles, and they are thinking in terms of how to use power. And then you've got another side that's like, just leave me alone. They think that somehow when the American founders conspired to create a new nation on the North American continent, that this was somehow libertarian. And I understand the argument for that, but ultimately when you look about it in historical context, the British Empire was looking to extract resources from North America and then leave the colonists alone for the most part, and leave them to some form of self-governance. And so the British really had the much more libertarian attitude toward America, where they were like, well, Americans, you've got the Pennsylvania Dutch, you've got your own colonies, you've got some religious freedom, we'll let you do whatever we want. We're Anglican, English, we're Anglican British, but you Americans, you do whatever you want, follow whatever religion you want. The founders said, we don't like that. They presented it as no taxation without representation, but they really wanted to create a nation. They wanted to create a power that would rival the British, that would take over this new continent in Manifest Destiny. That was their vision, and I don't think that was a libertarian vision ultimately. They weren't about low taxes. I mean, the first issue they had was the Whiskey Rebellion, where they started raising taxes on people. So I do believe taxes increased after the American Revolution. The British were for lower taxes. The founders were for higher taxes, ultimately. And of course, there were different founders, and they had disagreements and whatever. But, I don't think fundamentally America is about the increasing leave me aloneness of the individual. I don't think you look at American history and see a bunch of people who are just progressively over the time leaving each other alone more and more. I think we see the complete opposite. I think we see people who are more and more about imposing their will, centralization, religiosity. I think that's what we're seeing increase over time. That's what I describe as the deep left. This increase of centralization, the increase in religiosity. I think that's the long arc of history bends toward the deep left, and I wish people would recognize that, and I wish people would say, okay, well, if this is the arc of history, then we should figure out how to manage this. We should figure out who's going to be in charge of the deep left. Is it going to be the Democrats, or is it going to be another faction? Is there only one way to do this? Is the only way to have a deep left, is the only way to do it as they do with the critical theory? Is critical theory the only path toward a deep left? And it's victimary narratives, and we learned recently that from Mark Brauman that Homer is Jewish. So this has been going on for a very long time. I had to throw that in there as an aside. But that's pretty much what's going on with the election. Not too exciting. We'll see. Something very violent could happen. We always hope it doesn't happen, but something very violent could happen. I don't predict civil war. I predict, a martial law. You might have to stay inside for a little bit. If you don't go looking for trouble, trouble probably won't go looking for you. I would, as a precautionary measure, after voting is done, there's really no advantage to having a Trump sign on your yard or whatever. If people want to do that thing where they are loud and proud supporters and they want to, challenge people to come throw a Molotov cocktail through their window, I can't stop them. But, if you're looking to weather the storm ahead, just don't be an identifiable Trump supporter. And, there might be a repeat of this incursion into the suburbs and masses of people going to restaurants and harassing people and telling them that you have to denounce Trump, and if you don't, we'll threaten you. So we can see that sort of thing happening again. It's unfortunate, but I think it will pass. I don't think it's going to bear out into a civil war, because I ultimately don't believe that mobs and masses can ever create civil war. I think that is, by definition, impossible. I think the only people who can orchestrate a civil war are high-level actors, what we call societal administrators. These are the only people who are capable of making that decision. If you actually had Republicans who were theologically opposed to the Democrats and to critical theory and all of that, and they said, we're willing to fight and die for this, we're going to go full Jefferson Davis or whatever, then you would see a civil war. There's nobody like that. There is nobody willing to do that. Biden and Harris are fully on board with the military-industrial complex. There is no faction of elites that is really threatened by them. They're not saying we're going to confiscate Jeff Bezos' wealth. They're not saying, we're going to destroy the military. They're not saying we're going to make peace with Russia. They're not going to say we're withdrawing from the Middle East. They're not putting anything on the table that is fundamentally threatening to the system. So there's no one who's willing to go to war with them. There are probably people who are willing to go to war with Trump, but Trump doesn't have any allies. He doesn't have, again, Trump is not a military general. He doesn't have military assets. He doesn't have the capacity to declare war. If the establishment declared war on Trump, if they said, look, Trump, you've got to leave. We're sending in the military. He could tweet about it, but I don't think there's anybody who would defend him. I don't think he has the organizational capacity. He has supporters. He has mass support. He has millions of people who I'm sure would be willing to fight and die for him. But that doesn't matter. Millions of people don't matter if you don't have elites who are able to organize them and to coordinate them. I mean, all of these people, by the way, all these Trump supporters, the reason why 2016 worked out the way it did is because of social media. Social media can be shut down tomorrow. We've already seen with Twitter that they're willing to just censor websites they don't like, and there's nothing restricting them at this point. And even if there was some legal restriction, which there isn't, they would be willing to violate that if they needed to. So, all of that said, you have to vote, just like you have to exercise, you have to eat good foods, you have to you should seek out a good religious life. You should seek to build relationships. You should seek out the source of truth, beauty, and goodness, and you should be that source for other people. And don't allow the concept of futility to ever stop you from acting and from growing your discipline. People who, when I read the life of Cicero, or I listened to the audiobook, you could hear when Cicero and his faction lost after the rise of Augustus Caesar, you could see that he had this sense of futility, and a lot of people are going to be very depressed. Whether it's over the next 4 years with a lame duck Trump or a lame duck Biden, or some kind of massive revamping of democratic state religion, We don't know what's going to happen, but there are a lot of people who will be very depressed and dissuaded by this. We can't allow that to happen. That's the most important thing. Whatever happens in terms of policy, law, whatever it is, you have to understand that keeping faith and valuing your life, valuing your actions so that you can be a conduit for beauty in the world, no matter how small it is. You don't examine the scope of the world. You don't look at the universe in this cold, dark expanse and say, oh, the earth is a small, pale blue dot, like Carl Sagan said, and oh, don't you know, like, all these wars are stupid, and all of it doesn't matter, and we should just smoke weed and allow whatever happened to happen. It doesn't matter how many narratives. You can't believe those narratives. You simply have to ignore them. You have to recognize them as lies. You have to put them out of your head, and you have to replace them with other thoughts. It's not enough to say, don't think about an elephant, but you have to think about a tiger. You have to meditate on that. You have to imagine that. You have to focus on the vision of it. Get a visual representation. This is, for thousands of people, or thousands of years, this is what people have done. This is innate to the human psychology, that if you have a picture, if you have an icon, and you actually look on it and you stare at it and you meditate on it, that there is a reciprocal feedback exchange of power where you begin to perceive that icon as powerful, and it actually becomes a source of power to you. It's almost alchemy. This is basically magic, right? When you're able to imagine something as having power, therefore you're actually able to embed it with power, and then it's able to be a source. It's almost like a battery. It's almost like, I never watched the full Naruto series, but I was looking back, I was like, I guess it finished in 2016. I think they did the last episode. And I never got very far into it. But there's a battle where Naruto, he's created his shadow. If you've never watched it, this is all going to be ridiculous. But he's created some shadow clones, and they're meditating by a waterfall while he's battling this other guy, and he's filling them with chakra energy so that when his energy depletes, he can teleport his clones to himself. That will then give him more energy. So that's kind of what icons are like, right there. You're giving something energy, you're storing up energy within it, so that when you need that energy back, you can receive it. And again, it doesn't necessarily make sense in terms of an arithmetic view of the universe, of pluses and minuses, that, if I give some of my energy to some kind of icon, it's just going to give me the same energy back. There's no energy created or destroyed. But really, this is multiplicative. This is exponential. You give energy day by day by day, a little bit of energy, and that can have exponential results over time. So that's what people need to invest in. People need to keep their eye on the ball. And we have ancient myths. We know of the icon, we know of the vision of the man and the dragon. This goes back to Babylon, that we understand that we are put in situations where the forces against us seem so colossal and so insurmountable, and really they seem to relate to things inside of us, and they seem to encompass us and enframe us. But that has always been the condition. We can look back at a different struggle in a different time that we've overcome in this way or that way, relativize things, and we can look back in retrospect and say, okay, the problems people used to deal with were small. Our problems today are big, and they're of a different nature. And those problems were good problems, or those were easy to overcome, and our problems are impossible. But things always look easier in retrospect. You know, when you've achieved something, when you're going through something in the past, it can seem, you know, like, is this ever going to end? And then when it's over, it's like, oh, you know, it was like, it was there one day and then it was gone the next day. So perspective is important. The mindset is important. We should be able to do things without without our doubts becoming so powerful that they are paralyzing to us. We could go on. What if we reached the 40-minute mark? Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye-bye.